Today's author has independently published 12 books. She also illustrates her own work, and you can see several of her illustrations around the room. She recently showed off her artistry in the Los Gatos New Museum at their artist show that just closed. She teaches creative writing for Los Gatos, Campbell, and other adult ed programs. And today, she's going to talk to us about her first book in her series, Born in Berkeley. So please welcome Lynn Rogers.
Thank you. Good morning. How many of us remember the 60s? Even as teenagers and little kids. How many don't remember them but would enjoy knowing more about them? We live in a really pivotal area, the San Francisco Bay Area, and we were part of a lot of pivotal changes. I want to talk this morning about also the process of creativity and the process of writing. How many of you have thought of writing something controversial that held back because you're worried about who would read it, who would want to read it? Well, I've done all that, so I can tell you a little bit more about it. I'm considered a post-beat independent artist and author because I follow in the tradition of the beat generation. When I was 15 years old, by happenstance, I ended up 16 years old, in Mexico as a summer exchange student, and a lot of coincidental events led me to Ken Kesey's enclave, which included the great beat anti-hero Neal Cassady. Neal Cassady grew up in a Denver flophouse with his father who drank, but he appealed in sort of a James Dean-esque way to a lot of literary students in East Coast colleges like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and they were enraptured at taking bad boy trips across the country in cars that really didn't necessarily belong to Neal Cassady. And were there women of the beat generation? Yes. But this was both the greatest and the silent generation, so a lot of women were working for newspapers and magazines, doing all the laundry, having to do their writing in secret in the car, and taking care of the beats, who were men who were driving across the country. So yes, there were women beats like Diane DePrima, Carolyn Cassidy, Joanne McClure, and so many others. So I grew up in Menlo Park. My dad ran the United States Geological Survey. My parents met at UC Berkeley. He was of Pilgrim and Royal ancestry, and she was partly Bohemian, so with some Czech ancestry and some Alsace-Lorraine. They had come from very different backgrounds. They met after the war, World War II, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the influence of the greatest generation on the so-called 60s people. I dedicated Born in Berkeley in the back on making author's notes. Born in Berkeley is the memoir of a pivotal period in the mid-1960s. Although written as fiction, the facts are true. After the Beats, and before the hippies were coined by Herb Caen, many neighborhoods like Tupper's Park, in my story, sprang up on the San Francisco Bay Peninsula. The term beat really came from the New Testament Beatitudes, which spoke of living simply, some say. The meek shall inherit the earth. Beaten down by materialistic white American culture of the 40s and early 50s, beat outsiders wrote poetry to the beat of Negro hipsters' music. Meanwhile, mainstream World War II couples raised in the Great Depression bestowed attention and advantages on their post-war offspring. They gave their kids a lot. Patriotic ideas and the leisure to question the 50s emphasis on conformity. Look-alike houses covered up shameful social problems. The cultural pendulum had swung too far. A small percentage of youth born in this suburban security threw off their advantages and privilege. Very like the youth of 12th century Assisi, Italy, following Catholic saints Francis and Clare, after whom San Francisco and Santa Clara are named. The Assisi youth long ago tossed off their parents' cloth of gold. They cut their hair in this case, and they took to the road, following Christ's beat message. Like these, Carolyn Ryder, born in Berkeley, was ostracized by her peers, who today try to claim the Summer of Love as their own. But by 1967, the real 60s mavericks had done their work. Their civil rights, peace, and free speech marches had broken ground for be-ins and Grateful Dead music. Now even the popular kids who had ridiculed their few long-haired classmates came to hate in Ashbury streets in San Francisco, put on love beads for an hour on the weekend. The commercialized hippie was in vogue. But it is to the small group of 60s youth who first gave up privilege and followed that beat to the heart of a new and timeless life to whom this book is dedicated. We live in a very affluent area where today people are renting tents in yards for $900 a month. We live in a place of drought right now. We live in a place where our orchards have been paved over by concrete. And there are some values from the 60s that emerge from that pivotal time that are still helping us today. One is the move toward ecology, but the one that's really been forgotten is the move away from materialism. I grew up in Menlo Park near Atherton, and I left very young. Maybe that was a mistake, but it enabled me to meet lots of different kinds of people who didn't grow up there only, of diverse races and religious and ethnic backgrounds. I had a second Jewish mother for a while, my early college period, who had fled the HUAC, House Un-American Activities trials. I got involved in a Black Revival church in East Palo Alto, and I really had different experiences thanks to this sort of post-beat, pre-hippie energy. And that's what I began writing about. I don't stay only writing about that. I've written 12 books, which are here and available. But I sort of started there. Born in Berkeley, I grew to my teens in a post-war suburban tract south of San Francisco, where the beats, including the Cassidys, Ginsberg, and Kerouac, gathered. By 11, I'd roam alone at night out of Tupper's Park, down gray and white streets. It was a neighborhood of sameness. All I'd see above me were pinpricks of stars through the misty white streetlights, higher than maples plotted before the tract was conceived. Tupper's Park in the late 50s and 60s seemed like more of a town than a tract. Being the same was important to my mother. She joined the babysitting co-op that spread to most of the families in the park. On the roster she had were the secrets of its inhabitants. We were listed as the writers, Franklin and Charlene, with Carol and me, Susan, my younger sister, and my younger brother Keith. I liked to look at the unusual names on the sheet, though. I didn't feel normal. My mother would yell, "What's wrong with you? Why can't you be like the others?" Even though I was gifted, enriched with audio Spanish tapes in elementary school, junior high class valedictorian, captain of the basketball team, lead in the childhood plays, she blamed me for her problems. So we have a conflict starting in Carolyn Ryder's life that sort of pushes her to be on the road in her own way at a very early age. And this book takes her through the inception of the civil rights movement, the peace movement. She becomes involved with the Anti-Vietnam Day Committee in Berkeley with her older friend, Olive Schreibner, so called in this book. All of the major events in this book are true. Names have been changed. Sometimes they're fictional compression. They're events that may cross character. But it's really a true book that has its sort of climactic turnaround when Carolyn finds herself exposed to the beginnings of the the drug movement. Unlike a lot of people that I sometimes speak with at the Beat Museum in San Francisco, sparring with beatnikos, I find myself, I learned early on in life, maybe because my family has paradoxical reactions to eye drops and everything, that the drug scene isn't for me. And my high is the creativity, pure and simple. In fact, I even think that the potential for social change was disrupted in a way by that influence, and I'm not so sure where it really came from. There was a woman on KPFA radio years ago who talked about the early experiments in Nazi Germany, later the CIA, with the same kinds of drugs that turned up for free amongst people who were really quite idealistic to start out with, influenced by Quakers. So my book sort of talks about an axis between these two periods. And professor at UC Berkeley told me to write this, but he wouldn't put his name on it. Although written as a memoir, Carolyn Ryder's account of her life and times draws heavily upon the author's life experiences, a time I have come to call the beat hippie axis. And that's really what I'm writing about, but how I wrote it. I have two children. One has autism and disabilities, and the other one is gifted, though feels neglected by the special needs kid. And I was a young mom, caught up in all this, who would put aside writing and I'd put aside painting, till my other daughter said, "You're really good. You need to paint again and draw again." And I had gone back to San Jose State briefly and other places to immerse myself in creative writing technique, but the best person I had was actually in the community, Louise Vernon. Did this go up?
Maybe they accidentally pushed.
Oh, I pushed something. I'm quite a Luddite, so I tend to push things.
Well, it says it's on.
It says it's on.
So I don't know. Hello? No. Let me see
It's
if we
okay.
need a battery.
I'll just go on because I have good projection. So I had gone back to San Jose State and also had an adult ed teacher who was very fine, a wonderful person. And I learned from her and reading about Peter Elbow in Oxford that the whole trick to writing is to put the critic aside. That's what we teach in our writing classes and groups. That you need to put the critic aside, because the minute you start to write, that left brain planner that tells you how it should be, how it's not as good as someone else's writing, tanks you. And it's letting go and trusting, like Jack Kerouac of the Beats, your first impulse. Trust it and let it flow. Save punctuation, grammar, and logic for when you're way down the line, or you're in a writing group or something that helps you tune it up. It should be fun, it should be playful, and I had those early experiences under my belt, so I knew I could trust that energy. And so, but this was sort of the best of times and the worst of times. To be a young girl on the road like that was probably objectively dangerous, scary, and so being precocious, my character is often mistaken for someone older, but she's really a child and is exposed to things sometimes that we might really question today. On the back cover, author Thomas Hurst writes, it's like Lolita meets Holden Caulfield meets Fanny Hill. Set in the late 60s in Northern California and Mexico, where life was changing, feminism awakening, and discovering its independence from patriarchy. A refreshing look at a time when everything changed. A time when we found ourselves, so sweet and yet so frightening, this discovery of life. And Anne Marie Maxwell, whom I still know, who was way on the road, she was the lover of the great Neil Cassidy. He's the prototype character of Kerouac's book On the Road. We had a movie out a couple of years ago. He plays Dean Moriarty. I knew him. And she writes, his sweetheart in all those later days, I think this book is an important contribution to our knowledge of the 60s. I'm impressed. Fabulous descriptions of Ken Kesey and Mountain Girl. I loved Acapulco and Curly and McGee and their imagined sexuality. Why not call the book Growing Up in the 60s? So when I wrote it, I started out writing some short stories when I had returned to college. I went to Berkeley, dropped out, later graduated Antioch, and I have a master's in transpersonal studies. But at that point, I was a young parent, and I had the opportunity to immerse myself in creative writing in different arenas. And the first thing that emerged were short stories about being in Mexico. And then later, my daughter went to a camp for handicapped kids and brought back an illness when I did the laundry, and I was confined to the back of my house for months. I'd remarried a wonderful older fellow, or stepfather, and he was watching the kids, and I was recovering, so there was nothing for me to do but write, and it forced me to write the rest of this book. So I'm really glad, on the one hand, the memories were relatively fresh. This book was followed by what Dave Hickey, my editor, often calls your literary masterpiece, The Rainbow's Daughter. This is a book about a real New Age cult in San Jose, California. And the leader at the time was so charismatic that Sylvia Brown, who was offering readings and material in the same Campbell dance hall, was selling her work for 50 cents. No one was going, but this other woman, Marcia Hutter Mossman, young people were flocking to her combination of sort of New Age spiritual group. There was a great quest for truth, and then a real learning of how absolute power can corrupt in a leader. So my young character emerges into this scenario. I was studying writing with Louise Vernon, my mentor in the community, also the mentor of my colleague Catherine Wilson and others. And she asked me about the experience. I was coming out of the San Jose State immersion, and about 2 years away from contact with this group, and she said, well, tell me about it. So I said a few things and said a few things, and then I said a sentence, and I know as a writing teacher, a good teacher can hear your sentence. And I said, I was with him 7 years, and then one day I walked out and never came back. And she said, write that down. So that became the spine, the plot for The Rainbow's Daughter. I was with him 7 years, and then one day I walked out and never came back. They are all like faint shadows to me now, almost within my grasp. I won't let them go. I can't let them go. On nights like tonight, I remember them easily. It was another January night in 1970 in Northern California, and the sprawl of the city at the end of the bay was not much different from LA 20 or 30 years earlier. Awkward, but still imbued with a sense of beginning. I was still a teenager when I walked up to the door of that house on North Redwood Street for the first class of a course on how to remember your past lives. My hands pushed down in my pea coat pockets. I'd read about Edgar Cayce and past lives and followed a hunch to come here. Would this class show me more? Flashing lights from the Doggy Diner way across the wide lanes of traffic on Stevens Creek Boulevard spun ribbons of azure blue, gold cream, and burgundy gossamer around the circumference of the housetop. The sky wore a new moon as a single accent. A light rain, a little wind, and the whir from the distant lanes of traffic that fled from view had offset the sound of my own nervous heartbeat. And this begins a 7-year saga for my character, Carolyn Ryder. It turns out her middle name is Paige, and the leader decides she looks like a page boy, so she'll be Paige through this book. My books are written so they could be read separately in almost all cases, but they also have a connection. And so this is a story of the 70s and of a young woman who goes on to be married to somebody, a leader of one of the many spiritual search groups in our valley, directs her to. She ends up having a child like mine with special needs that are ignored at this point. She is on this great group quest for truth. She's singing "This is the Dawning of the Age of Aquarius" in shopping centers, and eventually she'll have to think about whether she wants to stay in this or not. She does meet a wise older mentor whom I've called Elizabeth, who kind of points her toward the light within her. So that's The Rainbow's Daughter. That was followed by Shadow Over the Beach. Shadow Over the Beach is kind of a Da Vinci Code around the theme of women's spirituality. My character, like me, became a graduate student crossing coasts to the enclave of America's sleeping prophet, Edgar Cayce, going to a graduate school there in transpersonal psychology, though not studying Cayce, but being immersed in that culture in the steamy South with lots of steam in her own life, adventures and misadventures. That is Shadow Over the Beach. And I kind of wrote about the segments before I go further, about the eras and epochs I'm writing about. When I found myself on the road with beat icon Neil Cassidy questioning the sexism in the 60s as a teenager in Ken Kesey's compound, I was the precocious kid drawing and writing poetry, influenced by the creative spirit of these older folks. And from that emerged Born in Berkeley, and the next book I'll talk about. In the 70s, like many young people who'd come out of these sort of political idealistic movements, there was the inner spiritual quest. There were groups like Est, Maharishi, the Jesus Freaks, so many others. But this is one that's documented now in this book that really existed right amid us and was led by a charismatic woman. It wasn't quite as extreme as some of the others. Lives were not in peril, but psychological life sometimes was. And so that's that book. I then went on to write a book that takes place in Los Altos, Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, and it is the intersection of the 80s with the 60s. My character, a bit older now, meets a college professor. They're coming into their 30s, and he says that they knew each other years and years ago back in the 60s. He says it with great force. Now that really happened to me. I actually was beginning to teach older adults. I love teaching mature, creative, powerful people. I've taught Los Gatos High School. I just love the older adult population because the depth of the writing and power of the writing gets better and better. So I actually had the experience of teaching at the Jewish Community Center and running into a fellow then who claimed later that he had known me 20 years before. And that became the fictional premise of this work. So let me just read an opening of that. Los Altos, California, 1985. Was she underdressed, long straight hair, bare skin, tube top, white coat over jogging pants with tennis shoes? Carolyn Ryder wondered. Probably, but it was warm, and the mentality of the 60s was hard to shed. This outfit felt right, and Carolyn always moved with her feelings. For over a month this time, her husband had been working around the clock. Silicon Valley engineers make deprived wives, she thought irritably for the 1000th time. She'd become dangerously angry lately, with fantasies of going to a bar or something out of spite. Coming here, however, could only be innocent and perhaps therapeutic. Carolyn strode through the late June heat toward the auditorium, where her senior citizen students would be presenting their vintage vaudeville play. A youngish man with dark curly hair, dressed in a suit too bulky for the June heat, had stopped at the head of the long walkway and peered at her with a gentle smile. He seemed to be waiting for someone. He looked to be about her age, maybe a bit older. In his mid-30s, they would obviously be the youngest people here. Her 82-year-old Irish friend, Emery Gallagher, in whom she often unwisely confided marital frustrations, had mentioned on the phone that a young PhD psychology teacher had also been invited to attend. This must be he. Is this the way back? Carolyn asked. She laughed. The way back? You mean to the theater? She nodded. So that's the third in the series of books that emerged from Born in Berkeley. The next two books, the fourth being Shadow Over the Beach, that had that Da Vinci theme of exploring spirituality, sexuality, gender, and was parallel to a nonfiction work I did on women's spirituality, Edgar Cayce and the Eternal Feminine. But I also wrote it in novel form in Shadow Over the Beach. Collie pulled her cloak around her, raised her arms to the full moon and drew down its power. She gazed back at the green-lit Edgar Cayce library building she had just exited, feminine and masculine, father god and mother goddess, pulling her in two directions. She was as magnetized to the library, rising through the moist, blustery air as she had been when she arrived in Virginia Beach for graduate study 2 weeks ago. My character in Virginia Beach has occasion to meet a couple at a convention prior to her school beginning, the man of whom introduces her to the concept that there are people who are transgender, transvestite, who have different orientations. My editor says that Revenge of the Goddess, which preceded 50 Shades of Grey by a number of years, I might say, and might be a little more literary, he said, Revenge of the Goddess reminds one of possibilities rather than limits in human intimacy. David Hickey, radio host. These two are really might be best read as a series, though they could be read independently. My character, with all the complexities of her life and exploring this ancient tradition of matrifocal culture and goddess power, attempts to sort of use it and maybe misuse it in some comedic and shadowy ways in this book, in company with her friend, the gentleman named Ken in this book with transgender issues. In the second of this couplet, he becomes ill and eventually dies at 50, and she can Kali keep the goddess's freedom, sensuality, and empowerment, but recover her compassionate side is the theme of this second of those couplets. So we have the book Where the Flowers Have Gone, which was about that sort of me-80s and the movement to some of the lost values of the 60s. In the 90s, I wrote books like Edgar Cayce and the Eternal Feminine, Shadow Over the Beach, Revenge of the Goddess, and Parting the Veil. Many were not published until much later. When you write, you make drafts and you may put a book aside for a long time. Usually they take about a year, I think, in a self-respecting book. But you'll pick it up maybe years later and revise it and look at it. I have a student who's spoken here before, Barbara Tinsley, who's just found a manuscript buried from decades ago. So these are things that can happen to an author. Then I went on to explore millennial themes. As baby boomers move toward the millennium, what happens to some of those early values and misdirection that's emerged from the counterculture movement? What happens in relationships, sexuality, spirituality, sense of purpose? So I started a series that I project as a quartet. And A Burst of Sunrise finds Carolyn Ryder determining to live out her novels and write out her life. But she encounters Southern writer Evelyn Dewey Swan. He also has a complicated life. He calls her from karmic entanglements to the timeless realm of soulmates beyond time. So this begins a couplet of mature persons and their quest for life, love, truth. This second book, some of my books have been quite favorably reviewed by Gary Singh of Metro, finds me likable, and this one is the second of that quartet. In it, she's found a soulmate, it appears, but their circumstances, particularly his, don't make him totally free to be in her life, so she sets about to kind of do her own Bay Area beat journey, internal psychological journey, and we visit the South Bay in a kind of stream of consciousness way through diverse friends and events that sort of outline what's happening in the millennial South Bay. In the spirit of a boomer beat style that so animates much of Roger's work, Hickey wrote, Side Roads deals with what John Lennon described as just what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. I take more side roads without you. From the pain of romantic travail can come opportunities, surprise, relief, and great joy. The latest novel, Side Roads, is Roger's returning, strong later, most humorous, lyrical, and captivating, a novel that enjoys itself like a Latin dance step. I think Gary Singh liked it because I just roamed around Japantown in San Jose, and Gary Singh of Metro doesn't have a car. He likes to find truth in the urban wasteland, so I had some fun in that part of town writing Side Roads, followed by the third in projected quartet, Swanigan, in which the soulmate quest and sort of romantic angst in a Bovary-like style takes my narrator to cross culture, and sometimes to look at the parallels in the lives and loves of persons in other races. I guess it could be described as a new age literary shade of gray. In 2006, I paired up with author Robert Burrell and looked at Alviso, which sort of fit me because Alviso it's sort of like the Sausalito of the South Bay. It's attracted poets and authors like Jack and Charmian London. It has a funky, offbeat history that appealed to me. So we collaborated, he may stop by here today, on Alviso. He had begun writing, collecting images when our paths crossed, but the publisher, Arcadia, that does the Images of America series, felt that he needed an author this time on board, and they made me swear I would actually personally write every word as he fed in photos. The fun of it was that we were very different. He wanted to write, what did he say, about men and boys, boats, trains, and planes. And I felt there were a few things lacking in that. So I started digging around in the Alviso library. A part-time librarian, Dean Baird, who later passed away, contributed greatly to my understanding. He thought I was in sync with his vision of Alviso. I find Alviso a fascinating place and have taken to singing there for fun in the last several years. My late father, Avery Rogers, got to be interviewed for this book because in 1968, the subsidence studies were done under his administrative leadership. But I found that I couldn't get away from novel writing, biographical or autobiographical novel writing, and so when I would hear about someone, it would evoke an entire story for me. And Thomas Funchu, for example, there are many streets in Alviso named after him, but he couldn't get educated in Alviso because he was Asian, and so he had to be educated in San Francisco, came back to take over the family canning business, and he developed ketchup. He had canneries in Mayfair, Palo Alto, on the Delta. He developed agricultural equipment, and when he died, 25,000 people came to his funeral. He had saved, through the Depression, he had big water tanks, and so he was someone who needed to be written about. I found that the police judge, the best police judge, was a woman, and I traced her family back to the Civil War. I looked at duck hunters, women and men out in the sunken drawbridge, and I was interested, as is probably unusual about me, I'm interested in both spiritual things and earthly things. And I noticed that Santa Clara, of course, was named after St. Clair, and we get back to the same theme in Born in Berkeley, the hidden theme of anti-materialism that's important to me. Living simply, honoring the earth, and I think that's a theme that's actually emerged in all of the books that I've written to date. I also illustrate. This was a drawing that I did in Palo Alto when I was 18 of a girl, maybe 17, of a girl older than myself, Frances Joy Bradbury, known as Jinx and Born in Berkeley. I didn't know I could draw because when teachers came to school, I grew up in Menlo Park, they would have you match the turkey that they drew, and I always drew something quite different. My mother, with her bohemian side, really encouraged creativity, made us throw out coloring books, douse ourselves in paint, run semi-nude through the yard, and paint on butcher paper as little kids. So she encouraged creativity, but I didn't really know I could draw until Joy said we were at the Lynn house in Palo Alto, which is near the police station, full of beads and some of the material that you see on the table. And she said, draw me, just draw what you see. So I started drawing, and opposed to women in previous history who could not go and look at models, we often had male models. A boy or boyfriend would tromp through, and she would say, take things off, we're going to draw you. And so I learned in that milieu to trust the creative impulse. I went on to illustrate in black and white some of Born in Berkeley, and now I'm a painter as well. My work is available on Fine Art America and other places. And I think that it's that early post-beat creative spirit to which I really credit the ability to also illustrate work. I teach for the town of Los Gatos. I teach memoir writing, but that class includes all forms of writing on Tuesday mornings. We'll start on September 15th this year. I'm teaching for Campbell Adult Ed at the Trinity Church on Union, and we're starting up now. Some of my students in this class have gone on, a number of my students, to publish very successfully, including some who began to get into print in their mid-80s. I had a woman, Carolyn Garrett, who came to my class in Los Gatos and said, I just have to get out from under Mother's shadow. And I said, well, what do you mean? She was in her early to mid-80s. And she said, well, my mother published her most successful book at 103. She was acclaimed by the governor at 107. She had a few days that she wasn't racing about and then passed peacefully from this world. And now it's my time. So she wrote her book, Short Skirts and Snappy Salutes, honoring World War II. I've come to see in retrospect, although starting as the rebellious kid with Greatest Generation parents, what a tremendous contribution the Greatest Generation really gave us, the freedom to rebel by saving this nation in many ways. So it was important to me. I've helped make films for the Story of Service project, write scripts in our class, and I have students here who have published very successfully, including Catherine Wilson, raise your hand, who is moving along with a couple of outstanding books. Barbara Tinsley, you've already heard, who came to my class as a recently retired college instructor from a college we were all writing about, we can't say what it is, and it has interesting characters. And I just was busy that morning and she said, well, what shall I do? And I said, well, just start doing free writing, don't criticize yourself. Poetry is flying out of her, and she's completed 2 novels going into print, a poetry book and a novel. And so we have some outstanding folks that are using some of this sense of trusting the creative energy within us to write successful books. I have a small publisher in Menlo Park. He worked for Sunset Magazine, and he was the printer for Pacific High School, run by Joan Baez. I did spend some time at that high school. We lived to tell the tale. Inkling Press. So my books can be found through me, through Inkling Press, at some independent bookstores, and my work is on Fine Art America. I have flyers up here and wanted to pass if anyone wants to stay in touch, both with a flyer or just to let us know who you are. I tend to be much of a Luddite, but once in a blue moon might call you and say, there's something fun coming up. So if you wish to just pass that about, that would be great, or take a flyer, please do so. And so I wanted to open up to questions at this point, or comments. Does anyone have a question or a comment? Yes?
What do you think the main legacy of the beat generation or E generation, what has persisted today that's still part of our culture?
Good and bad things have persisted. There's a lot of, the beats weren't as much the drug culture as the second, and the people in the middle were not so much the drug culture, but later what I feel was a shadow over it was the drug culture that has persisted in negative forms without a connection to the idealism that was part of it. On the other hand, ecological movements, I can't say the women's movement because it was pretty caveman-like in those days. The women's movement came a bit later, but ecological movements, creativity, spontaneity, that's what I think. And anti-materialism could be the good legacy, that people are valuable not by where they live, what they possess, but that we can find joy in simple joys and pleasures. Anyone else have a comment about the time? Yes?
Why do you think this period of time came to a close? What do you think caused it to end?
Well, I honestly think that the drug movement, I know there are people who had fun times, and those are their times, or may find good use of things, but I think that it was overall a shadow that sort of fell over the idealism of it, and it turned people's attention away from the optimism and the hope that they could make valuable changes. So for me, that would be it. And maybe it was in its positive sense, even through parts of the 70s, a Camelot, a shining spot. That there are there are cyclic changes. I watch a lot of Turner Classic Movies. There were epics in the 30s. There are certain epics that, windows open and then structure and other forces return. But we in the Bay Area really are the product of it in lots of ways, even if we didn't take active part. Anyone else who has a comment on the time? And then I might just do, yes, go ahead.
Do you think that today's tech culture has any kind of connection with the 60s, even the beat periods earlier than that?
You asked a really important question that you probably have more knowledge about, or my late husband might. But it seems like the trusting of one's creative impulse and being willing to be a maverick, being willing to be different, being willing to move out of conformity, to break ground, might be a possible overlay. And some of the people of that generation were active in it. Any questions about the books or comments? I might just read a little bit more.
What year did Born in Berkeley get published?
Born in Berkeley was published in 2002. It had a second edition more recently. And so, and it has been, my books are probably my fault, has been in continuing to create. I've never been a mass market person, but I have a kind of an underground independent following. A professor will contact me recently from Claremont College. They're doing work on Kesey, and so my books have been in the Beat Museum in San Francisco. I'm doing a literary event on September 28th at the Camden Community Center that will tie in both the Beat and local author themes.
Did you ride on Kesey's bus?
I painted it. So if you look at the right front door in the it might be going to the Smithsonian. I painted, I know it was black, at that time we had black, green, and white. Let me just read to you a little bit about painting that. Hold on a moment. Chapter 12, it was a fast, dark drive over unpaved road and sand dunes. Raging through the night, Norris, her 19-year-old boy, squeezed my thigh. He was going to meet Dean Moriarty, Kerouac's hero of On the Road. In real life, Neil Cassidy. I knew what that meant to him. We disembarked in blackness and the sound of slapping sea. A low-ceilinged house, Mexican Eichler style, lots of rooms. Apparently, everybody slept. Gordon Fraser led us to a right front bedroom. You can use Mountain Girl's room tonight. She's with George, man. Our new friend sounded hesitant, like we should know that. You'll have to ask her tomorrow. Left alone in the room, we shied away from the bed where leftover covers entwined like sweating flesh. We stayed away from someone else's love altar. Instead, we unrolled our blanket near a wall and lay still and separate in the buzzing night heat. In the morning, the main room filled with racing children. Long-haired men and women, the core group of merry pranksters. A woman plunked peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on long tables. The children ate in shifts. She left some for us too, like we were children. Yours wolfed his, Ambrosia. Afterwards, Mountain Girl is really Carolyn Adams, the descendant of President Adams, and Ken Kesey has just had a baby for Ken Kesey, although he's married, but maybe Anyway. Afterwards, Mountain Girl, 6 feet tall, two-toned hair, who just had a baby rumored to be Ken's, even though he had a wife, led us outside toward the Merry Pranksters bus. She didn't explain. We followed her. By now, I learned her real name was Carolyn Adams, descendant of the presidential Adams. Outside, Norris jostled my elbow. Neil Cassidy is here someplace. In the daylight, we could see that the Merry Pranksters occupied 2 houses separated by a wide expanse of sand. The bus, an old school bus painted with psychedelic swirls, was parked midway, a gathering place. Some days, Gordon had said, the pranksters made attempts to refurbish it, 3/4 of them stoned at all times. In the light, Mountain Girl seemed taller than her full-bodied, statuesque 6 feet. She toted her newborn infant daughter to the ocean, bent and dangled tow-headed baby sunshine over the water, her own dyed blonde hair coming in dark at the roots. She rinsed a wad of brushes at the water's edge, came up on the sand, and oversaw the bus painting. You can do this part. She shoved a small brush my way. She didn't even look at me. I accepted the brush like a scepter. Gordon, shining, handsome, rocked, undulated up close to us, blowing a joint. On the hinge of a sinewy arm, he flipped the plump, burning number into our faces. Norris slipped his fingers around it and sucked it up between Julie Christie lips, more energetically than I'd ever seen anyone suck anything. He gave it to me, eyes glittering like lights, with flecks of stroboscopic flash. Gordon shimmied, a beach man snake. I grabbed the joint and sucked. Left high to paint the bus, life under the brush got ugly. Every stroke became choppy like the cacophonous arrhythmia of my heart. What else was in the prankster's pot? An overly long, metallic 2 hours later, Mountain Girl came back to scrutinize. I saw her coming, stepped aside. Who did this? She barked about the flap behind the front, narrow, passenger side window. Looks like a kid did it, she scowled. Grateful for Mountain Girl's stone memory loss, she should have remembered it was me. I crouched like a kid on the bus running board, not saying a thing. 2 men emerged from behind the bus. Mountain Girl hailed them. Ken, Neil. It's too hot to paint anymore now. She stopped us at the men's arrival. Do it later. The painting project dismissed, she navigated from tall hips on long legs toward a meaty, curly, gold-haired man who slipped his arm around her waist. This must be Kesey. Norris dropped his brush on the fender. Did she say Neil, 2-man? He asked me. She said Neil. Blushing, panting, Norris loped toward Mountain Girl and the golden rider hero, Kesey. I followed, hidden from Mountain Girl in Norris's shadow. Norris looked past them for someone else, his eyes falling first upon a clean-cut, black-haired, sky-blue-eyed Lancelot who'd come to join Kesey on his right. Norris looked at me in triumph. He was in love. Neil Cassidy, he affirmed shyly. No, Mountain Girl shook her head. That's only Babs. Then a gaunt, grizzled, short 50s style hair man who looked at least to be 60 years old, twitching, talking to himself, bobbed and wove out from behind Ken Kesey. I could see why it had taken him a long time to walk a few feet with Kesey. The grizzled man rocked and trembled from the shoulders like someone who had held him there and was shaking him out. He trembled toward us and clamped a skeletal hand on Norris's shoulder, quipping, laughing, talking back to himself as he spoke. Who's asking? Who's asking? Har har. Gordon prodded Norris in the ribs. Norris, meet Neil, Dean Moriarty from On the Road to you. Norris, befuddled, looked from the image of the first hero, handsome, deep blue-eyed guy on Ken's right to the bobbing, irritated old man who was everywhere at once. Gordon, obviously embarrassed in front of Ken, his hero, plunked Norris's butt and pushed him out of the little circle toward the real Neil, who'd released Norris and shook and shuddered in circles around us, making speed freak mouth noises like the bright, weird kid from the briefcase who'd slobbered and said beep beep to the other boys in line at my junior high school. Oh, Norris sucked in his breath and to his credit switched dreams and followed the old man who drew him, vibrating down the beach, jabbing at the air with long bony fingers, flapping leathery elbows, followed Neil Cassidy, who twisted and spun like the eternal Pied Piper. Neil Cassidy in loose jeans and worn undershirt impelled Norris along. Norris, who bared his smooth golden chest over rolled-up white Navy issue pants, Norris looked like an angelic choir boy following the lead of the ferryman into the underworld, compelled along behind him in untied tennis-shoed feet into a ghostly realm. So, I'll stop there. I hope you'll enjoy more in Berkeley and maybe some in this series. And it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, but I feel honored to be able to tell these tales, embarrassed at times. Sometimes when I wrote the steamy scenes, I didn't have the nerve to read them to my writing teacher, so I mumbled over them, and it's full of steam because I never edited out some of them. I also have one other book I didn't mention that I wanted to touch into. This is my work of 100% pure fiction. It's called A Valley of Ashes, and Gary Singh said someday he thought this would put our area on the world literary map, so he's a big fan. And it is about, this book depicts life on the edge of Silicon Valley after 9/11 events spark secret operations in an historic factory based on the GE nuclear plant at Kurgan. It is revealed through the viewpoints of Darla Hull, who picked fruit here as an Archie child, and Paddy Kovarik, who lost his job to the dot-com crash and drink. Fate throws these thwarted midlife lovers in with deposed idealists like Orthodox leasing manager Mort Mackline, frightened youth like Jeffrey Baudelaire, punk, goth, Zazie, and other homeless hiding in the factory. Action runs from the beginning of Rosh Hashanah to its conclusion when deadly forces explode. The misfits reach for earth beneath concrete and for safety found only in each other's heart. And I'd say if I would sum up the themes of all my work that's underneath, to reach for the earth beneath the concrete and for safety found in each other's heart. And I thank you, and will be available with the books.